More twists and turns in the disappearance of Nancy Guthrie. The FBI now saying that some of the ransom notes sent to news outlets earlier this year were not legitimate. The Phoenix office posting, quote, the FBI and its task force partners have received several ransom notes over the course of this investigation. Some have been deemed to be extortion attempts without legitimacy. Other ransom demands may potentially be legitimate and are still being investigated as such.
5 months into one of the most closely watched disappearance cases in recent American history, a report landed that did not just shake the investigation. It threatened to dismantle the entire framework that investigators, the family, and the public had been operating inside of since February. Reuters, one of the most respected and rigorously sourced news organizations on the planet, published a report citing a direct FBI source who stated, without qualification, that none of the ransom notes in the Nancy Guthrie case are believed to be genuine. Not some of them, not the ones from the third sender, all of them. Every note, every demand, every communication that had been analyzed, debated, held for months, and treated as potentially credible evidence of a kidnapping for ransom. According to that FBI source, backed up by a second law enforcement source who confirmed the assessment independently, the entire written record of contact from whoever took Nancy Guthrie was fabricated by people who had nothing to do with the crime. If that is true, the implications are staggering. Because if every note is fake, then the question that Reuters itself raised in the same report becomes the most urgent and most unanswered question in this entire case. Why would anyone take an 84-year-old grandmother from her home in the dark of night if the motive was not ransom? Nothing was stolen from the house. No valuables were taken. No financial accounts were accessed. If money was not the motive, then what was? And if 5 months of investigation have been partially organized around the framework of a kidnapping for ransom, what happens to that investigation when the ransom component is removed entirely? This is where this case stands right now. And it is more complicated, more layered, and more revealing than any single report has captured, because the Reuters story is not the whole picture. And the reason it is not the whole picture tells us something critical about the state of this investigation that has not been said clearly enough anywhere else. If you are the kind of person who needs the complete truth and not just the version that fits into a headline, subscribe to Brian Case Records right now and turn on your notifications. This channel does not stop at the surface. We go all the way in. Let us start with what Reuters actually reported, because the precision of the language matters enormously here. Reuters cited an FBI official who told them, and this is a direct quote, none of the ransom notes are believed to be genuine. A second law enforcement source confirmed that assessment. Reuters also reported that the FBI believes the first two notes, the initial ransom demand sent to KOLD and TMZ on February 2nd, and the second note sent only to KOLD on February 6th, came from the same sender. The determination that those two notes shared an origin was likely made early in the investigation through matching Bitcoin wallet information and matching IP address data, even though the cloaking software used made full tracing impossible. Reuters further reported that the FBI completely discounted the third category of communications, the collection of messages sent to TMZ by a different party, claiming to know who committed the crime and offering to identify the perpetrators for payment of 1 Bitcoin. That third category of communications is worth examining separately because it has a distinct character from the first two notes. The sender of those third messages never claimed to have taken Nancy. They claimed to know who did. The demand was not framed as ransom for a living hostage. It was framed as payment for information, an offer to sell out the perpetrators for approximately $60,000 to $80,000, depending on the Bitcoin price at the time of each message. The most recent of those communications claimed the sender had video footage of the primary suspect alongside Nancy on what was described as her last day. That claim, according to the Reuters report, was assessed by the FBI as not legitimate, and an arrest was made in California in connection with at least some of that activity, suggesting that law enforcement had identified at least one individual responsible for the fraudulent communications in that third category. So the Reuters picture, taken at face value, presents a case where every written communication that arrived after Nancy's disappearance was produced by opportunists, scammers, and fraudsters who had no involvement in the actual crime and were attempting to extract money or attention from a high-profile situation. It is a picture that strips the kidnapping for ransom framework away from the case entirely and leaves investigators with what they physically documented at the scene. Unknown male DNA recovered from inside the home. Doorbell camera footage of a masked figure in dark clothing, moving with deliberate purpose. Evidence of simultaneous internet outages in the surrounding neighborhood, consistent with the use of a wireless jamming device. And a trail of blood droplets near the front entrance of Nancy Guthrie's home, leading out the door. That is what remains if every note is fake. And it is both more and less than it might appear. More, because physical evidence of this kind is durable in a way that written communications are not. DNA does not lie about its presence. Camera footage does not fabricate a masked figure. Blood at a crime scene does not generate itself. Less, because 5 months into the investigation, there has been no public update on whether the unknown male DNA has been matched to a known individual, no confirmation that the masked figure has been identified, and no official statement connecting the physical evidence to a named suspect. But here is where the Reuters report runs directly into a wall of contradictory information from a source whose involvement in this case is not peripheral. Harvey Levin, the executive producer and founder of TMZ, received the first ransom note on February 2nd alongside the two Tucson television stations. He subsequently received the third collection of communications from the party claiming knowledge of the perpetrators. And when the FBI responded to those communications, they did not send a single agent to TMZ's offices. They sent 5, working simultaneously alongside TMZ's own information technology team, going through every server in an attempt to trace the origin of the messages. Harvey Levin has been ingrained in this investigation from its earliest days. He has ongoing contact with multiple FBI agents directly involved in the task force. When the Reuters report published, he called his contacts immediately. And what his contacts told him is the reason this story is more complicated than any single report can capture. According to the sources Harvey Levin reached after the Reuters publication, there are multiple FBI agents involved in this investigation. Some are on the task force. Others are involved in adjacent capacities. And if you ask any of them their individual assessment of the ransom notes, their authenticity, their origin, and their relevance to the case, you will get different answers. Not because some of them are wrong and some are right in a simple sense, but because within a complex, multi-agency investigation of this scale, different agents working different aspects of the case develop different assessments based on the specific evidence they have access to and the specific analytical lens they apply to it. A Reuters source expressing one FBI opinion and a Harvey Levin source expressing a contradictory FBI opinion are not necessarily in conflict in the way that two witnesses giving different accounts of the same event would be. They may simply be reflecting the genuine internal disagreement that exists within the task force itself. Former FBI profiler Jim Clemente, who is well known in the investigative community and whose expertise in behavioral analysis is extensively documented, assessed the competing reports and offered his conclusion. He stated that Harvey Levin's reporting is more legitimate in this context, specifically because Harvey's sources are directly and actively involved in the investigation, rather than commenting from a position of partial or secondhand knowledge. That assessment from a former FBI profiler with Clemente's credentials is not a minor footnote. It is a significant piece of analytical weight placed on one side of a scale that the Reuters report had briefly tipped in the other direction. If you are still watching at this point, drop a comment with, "I'm still here." Let us see who is truly following this story all the way through, because what comes next is the detail that nobody has fully examined, and it changes the way this entire case looks from the ground up. Now look at the official statements that came from the two agencies publicly leading this investigation, because those statements are doing something very specific and it is worth reading them carefully. The FBI's Phoenix field office issued a statement confirming that the task force has received several ransom notes over the course of the investigation. They stated that some have been deemed to be extortion attempts without legitimacy. They stated that other ransom demands may potentially be legitimate and are still being investigated as such. And they stated clearly that this case continues to be investigated as a kidnapping for ransom case. That statement does not say all notes are fake. It explicitly acknowledges that some notes may potentially be legitimate. It explicitly maintains the kidnapping for ransom framework as the active investigative posture. That is not the language of an agency that has internally concluded every communication was fraudulent. The Pima County Sheriff's Department, which the FBI's own statement identified as the lead agency in this investigation, issued its own statement. They confirmed receipt of information regarding potential ransom notes. They confirmed that every tip and lead is taken seriously and forwarded to detectives working in coordination with the FBI. And then they directed all questions about the ransom notes specifically to the FBI. Read that sequence again. The FBI says local authorities are the lead. Pima County says refer all note questions to the FBI. The circularity of that arrangement is not accidental. It is the language of two agencies managing a public information environment around an active investigation where premature disclosure could compromise specific operational activities. Neither statement confirms the Reuters claim. Neither statement fully contradicts it. Both statements are calibrated to say as little as possible while maintaining the appearance of transparency. Pima County has not held a press conference since approximately the first week of the investigation. That extended silence from the lead agency in one of the most high-profile kidnapping cases in recent American history has generated enormous frustration among the public, among journalists covering the case, and among investigators who believe public engagement is a critical tool in generating the tips and information that break cases open. The silence is not evidence of wrongdoing. Investigative silence in active cases is often operationally justified, but in the absence of official information, the space fills with competing reports, contradictory sources, and the kind of narrative confusion that the public experience of this case has been defined by since February. What makes the Reuters report particularly significant, regardless of whether its specific claim about all notes being fake is ultimately accurate, is the question it forces into the open. If none of the ransom notes are genuine, then the Kidnapping for Ransom framework that has organized the public understanding of this case for 5 months rests on nothing. And the question of why Nancy Guthrie was taken becomes not just unanswered but structurally unaddressed. The Reuters report acknowledges this directly. It raised the issue itself. If there was no ransom motive and nothing was taken from the house, what explains the crime? Who takes a grandmother? That question does not have a clean answer in the publicly documented evidence. But there is a piece of analytical work that has been done around the language of the notes themselves that adds a dimension to this case that the mainstream coverage has not examined with sufficient depth. And it starts with two words that struck almost everyone who read the second note as unusual: perished and buried with nature. Those are not phrases that most native English speakers would naturally produce in the context of a kidnapping communication. Perished is a formal, almost literary word for death. It is not the word a person writing quickly and under stress in their native English would reach for. And buried with nature is a construction that sits awkwardly in standard English. Nature is not something you bury someone with in conventional English phrasing. You bury someone in nature. The preposition is wrong, the construction is wrong, and that wrongness is not random. It is the kind of wrongness that linguists and forensic language analysts recognize as the product of translation. Investigative journalist Ashley Banfield, who has been covering this case with documented law enforcement sources embedded in the investigation, worked with a native Spanish speaker to test this theory directly. She asked her to construct sentences that a kidnapper might use in two specific scenarios. The first, a ransom demand stating that the kidnapper has the victim and wants money. The second, a communication expressing that something went wrong, the victim died, the death was unintentional, and the sender had at least done the right thing by burying her properly and peacefully. Those sentences were constructed in natural, conversational Spanish, the kind of language a Spanish speaker would reach for without straining or forcing the phrasing. They were then run through Google Translate to produce an English version. The translation came back with the word perished, and it came back with the construction buried with nature, almost exactly the phrasing of the second ransom note. That is not a coincidence that can be easily dismissed. The specific linguistic awkwardness of the second note's most memorable phrases maps directly onto the output of translating natural Spanish death and burial language into English through a standard translation tool. This suggests, with significant linguistic support, that the author of those notes was not a native English speaker, that they wrote in Spanish and either used a translation tool or translated their own writing in a way that preserved the structural patterns of Spanish rather than producing idiomatic English. And that suggestion has a documented investigative context. Investigative reporter Michael Ruiz noted that Wi-Fi jammers of the type discussed in connection with this case had been used by South American burglary rings operating in affluent American neighborhoods in the months prior to Nancy's disappearance. The possible use of a wireless jammer at the crime scene, the specific targeting of an upscale residential property, and the linguistic evidence of a Spanish-speaking author of the ransom notes all point toward a suspect profile with a specific geographic and cultural origin. None of this is a conclusion. The documented evidence does not establish with certainty who wrote those notes, whether all of them or some of them are genuine, or whether the perpetrator of the crime and the author of the notes are the same person. But the convergence of the linguistic evidence with the physical evidence from the crime scene creates a suspect profile that is more specific than anything the official investigation has confirmed publicly. And it is a profile that the FBI's behavioral analysts have had access to for months. Former FBI Supervisory Special Agent James Hamilton, the founder of the Hamilton Security Group, with between 3 and 4 decades of experience investigating kidnappings and violent crimes, offered an assessment of the notes that cuts directly to the core of what makes them forensically significant. He stated that the notes are inconsistent with proper kidnapping protocols. That phrase, inconsistent with proper kidnapping protocols, is the analytical key to understanding everything that is confusing about the written communications in this case. Professional kidnapping operations, the kind executed by organized criminal groups with operational experience, follow a specific behavioral logic. The notes they produce are tools of negotiation. They are designed to create pressure while maintaining the credibility of the threat. They provide proof of life because proof of life is what compels payment. They establish communication channels that allow for a controlled negotiation process. They are stern, but they offer hope, because hope is the mechanism that drives a family to comply with demands. The notes in the Nancy Guthrie case do none of those things consistently. The first note set a deadline and then went silent when it passed. The second note arrived after the deadline and announced a death rather than escalating the demand. There was no proof of life at any point. There was no controlled negotiation channel. The communications were sent to media organizations rather than directly to the family or through a secure channel that only the perpetrator and the investigators would know about. That pattern is not the pattern of an experienced criminal organization executing a ransom operation. It is the pattern of people who understand the concept of a ransom note from cultural exposure, possibly from media, possibly from general knowledge of how kidnappings work in the abstract, but who have not executed this kind of operation before and who made critical errors in how they structured the communication. Whether those people are the same individuals who physically took Nancy Guthrie or whether they are the opportunistic fraudsters that the Reuters report describes is the question that the investigation has not resolved publicly. And the answer to that question is the difference between a case that has a coherent motive and a case that remains structurally unexplained 5 months after a woman was taken from her home. What the physical evidence at the crime scene tells us is that whoever entered Nancy Guthrie's home on the night of February 1st was prepared in ways that genuine opportunists are not. The deliberate camera awareness of the masked figure, the simultaneous internet outages in the surrounding neighborhood, the apparent use of a wireless jamming device that requires deliberate procurement, the knowledge of the back kitchen door being regularly left unlocked, the non-public details about the interior of the home that the first note contained, the specific knowledge of what Nancy wore when she went to bed, all of that preparation points towards someone who had invested significant time and effort into understanding that specific target before they ever approached the property. That level of preparation does not align with an impulsive or opportunistic crime, and it does not align with a purely financially motivated operation that subsequently fell apart because the perpetrators panicked and killed their hostage within hours of taking her. It aligns with a targeted operation where the target herself was the specific objective, not simply a means to a financial end. And that alignment between the sophistication of the physical preparation and the possibility that the ransom framework was either secondary or entirely constructed as misdirection is what the investigation must now contend with in the absence of the note framework that organized the case for 5 months. The unknown male DNA recovered from inside the home remains the single most significant unresolved physical evidence in this case. 5 months in, there has been no public statement about whether that DNA profile has been run through federal databases, whether it has produced a match, or whether investigators have been able to determine whether it belongs to the perpetrator or to someone with a legitimate prior reason to have been inside the house. DNA evidence in an active investigation is typically held close precisely because it is the kind of evidence that can collapse a prosecution if it is mishandled, or if its existence becomes known to a suspect who might take steps to complicate its use. The silence around the DNA is not necessarily a sign that it has produced nothing. It may be a sign that it has produced something that the investigation is not ready to discuss publicly. The camera footage of the masked figure remains the most visible piece of evidence in this case, and the one that has generated the most public analysis. The figure's deliberate movement, their awareness of the camera's position, and the apparent effort to block or adjust the camera's view of the entry point all reflect a level of operational awareness that is inconsistent with an amateur who stumbled into this crime without preparation. Whether that footage has produced identifiable details that investigators have been working quietly, whether the specific backpack, clothing, or physical characteristics of the figure have been cross-referenced against other footage or databases, has not been publicly confirmed. In the Wi-Fi jammer question, the one that prompted investigators to go door-to-door in the surrounding neighborhood asking about internet outages on the night of February 1st, remains officially unconfirmed. Sheriff Chris Nanos, when pressed by reporters on whether a jammer was used, said only that his team had examined every angle with the FBI. That is a statement calibrated to neither confirm nor deny. But the door-to-door canvassing of neighbors specifically about internet disruptions is not something investigators do without a reason. They had a reason. Whether that reason produces a confirmed forensic finding that connects to a named suspect is the question that the investigation has not yet answered publicly. 5 months in, no arrest, no named suspect, no confirmed resolution of the DNA evidence, no official confirmation of whether the Wi-Fi jammer evidence has produced a lead, 2 official agencies whose public statements contradict each other about the authenticity of the ransom notes. A Reuters report citing FBI sources saying all notes are fake, a direct contradiction from Harvey Levin, whose sources say the picture is more complicated than that. Official FBI and Pima County statements that maintain the kidnapping for ransom framework, while acknowledging that some notes have been deemed illegitimate, and a linguistic analysis that points toward a Spanish-speaking author of the notes whose phrasing maps onto the output of translating natural Spanish death and burial language into English. This is where the Nancy Guthrie case stands, not at a conclusion, not at a resolution, at a convergence of competing narratives, each one documented, each one sourced to credible reporters or officials, and none of them fully consistent with the others. The truth of what happened to Nancy Guthrie on the night of the 1st of February 2026 is somewhere inside that convergence, and finding it requires exactly the kind of sustained, detailed, source-by-source examination that the mainstream coverage of this case has not consistently provided. James Hamilton's assessment that the notes are inconsistent with proper kidnapping protocols is the analytical foundation for everything that needs to happen next in understanding this case. Because if the notes do not reflect the behavior of a competent kidnapping operation, and if the physical evidence at the crime scene reflects a level of targeted preparation that is inconsistent with a purely financial motive, then the question of what this crime was actually about is still wide open. And that question is the one that this investigation needs to answer before it can arrive at the truth of what happened to a retired school teacher, a grandmother, a woman who could not walk to the end of her own driveway without stopping to catch her breath, who was taken from her home in the dark and has not been found. We are going to keep following every development in this case with the depth and the sourcing it demands. Every verified detail, every credible report, every piece of documented evidence that surfaces will be examined here. If you believe Nancy Guthrie deserves the full truth and nothing less, like this video right now and subscribe to Brian Case Records. Your support is what keeps this investigation going and what ensures that cases like this one do not get buried under the weight of official silence and contradictory headlines. We are not done, not even close. Stay with us for part 2, where James Hamilton's full analysis goes deeper into what the behavioral evidence reveals and what investigators are actually working with behind the scenes of this case.